Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast about ancient Egypt with Dr. Chris Naunton and Izzy Lawrence. In this episode, we talk about the most controversial pharaoh of all, Akhenaten. Hello, and welcome to Talk Like an Egyptian. I am Izzy Lawrence. Over there is Dr. Chris Naunton.
Hello, everyone.
We've got an exciting episode. I'm really looking forward to this episode today because it is all about the pharaoh that was weird, the weirdest one, and there are a lot of weird ones, let's face it. I mean, Cleopatra, I think, is very weird, but this one is like super duper weird. And it is, do you want to introduce?
Akhenaten.
Yes!
I've just done it. Yeah, I've just done it, yes.
That's brilliant.
There we go.
Tutankhamun's daddy.
Maybe, but maybe not.
Well, yeah, but I'd like to...
Just to be absolutely clear.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
His daddy, I reckon. I reckon. I'd put money on it.
On the basis that some of my colleagues are absolutely clear that it definitely is, and there's no possibility of anything else and no evidence that it could be anybody else. That's why I say it.
Fair enough. Well, here we go. Right. Okay. So let's do. So we're spending an entire episode on one pharaoh, which means there's a lot to talk about. Why is there a lot to talk about? Because he was very weird. Should we start with when he was?
Yes. Yes, we can. So he reigned towards the end of the 18th dynasty. So the 18th dynasty is part of the New Kingdom. 18th, 19th and 20th are what we refer to as the New Kingdom. This is a period when Egypt was very wealthy and powerful.
They started burying people in the Valley of Kings. It's
the period of the Valley of the Kings, precisely. Yeah, it comes into use at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, falls out of use at the end of the 20th. And we are, in the time of Akhenaten, we are very approximately 1400 BC, about 3,400 years ago, with the very heavy caveat that we can't really be more precise than that in the terms of absolute dates because of the fact that we're still arguing about the total length of Egyptian chronology and that sort of thing. Yeah, somewhere between 3,500 years ago towards the end of the 18th dynasty, very, very good time for Egypt.
But is it a good time for Egypt? Because up until this point, Egypt has been a certain way. So should we talk about Akhenaten's dad very briefly? Because he comes into power and there's a sort of bit where there's a bit of transfer over where Akhenaten sort of takes over a bit. Am I thinking that right? So they sort of
you
work
are.
together
Yeah, no,
for a
absolutely.
bit?
Yeah, bang on. As usual, I'm beginning to wonder if I'm in fact redundant here.
Not at all. Because I've read something and I've gone, am I remembering that right? And if I am, great. And if I'm not, there's no guarantee. So
no, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So Akhenaten's father was Amenhotep III.
Favourite one.
Who has a very, very interesting reign all of his own.
Is he the one with the bad teeth? Is he that one? There's loads of them about that era that have really bad teeth and they get really bad infections because their teeth are worn away. I thought that was him.
Maybe right. We do have his mummy. So that would be the way that we would know about such things, I think.
Oh yeah. They get these terrible infections because the enamel wears away on their teeth, which suggests they were eating sand, which is just like
probably mixed into the bread. I think is that the idea?
Yeah, I think so. Well, that's nobody knows exactly why they all did, but they seem to have done, which is just the most painful and horrible way to go ever by tooth abscess. And it would eventually get sepsis and heart attacks and things. So. Anyway.
And that's all for this week's episode.
That's not what he's famous for, though. That is not.
No, exactly. No, I'll have to look into that. I don't know if he had worse teeth than anybody else. I don't know.
One of them definitely died of it. Because I did this is why I can't remember this. About 8 years ago, I was doing a podcast for the British Museum, and I'm sure I interviewed somebody, and I'm sure it was Akhenaten's. No, I'm not sure it was Akhenaten's dad. I think it might have been Akhenaten's dad. It's the one of the Hoteps. I'm sure it was whose mummy that we do have, who did have massive abscesses due to the fact that the teeth enamel was worn away, and there's loads of mummies with like hardly any teeth enamel.
That makes sense. Yeah, not something I know a great deal about, but that does make sense. And we do have Amenhotep III's mummy, so we could ask that question of that his human remains.
Well, you don't ask them. What you do is you take him into a hospital on an off day. So, like on a Sunday, you can take him into the hospital and they let you use the MRI.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
the fun thing. And you hope, not because you want there to be a car crash or some serious emergency, but you just hope there isn't one, so the MRI isn't needed. And
Yes.
then you just scan all your bits. It's quite fun. CT
Yeah.
scans as well, I think, rather than MRI, actually. Can't remember. Is that the same thing? Who knows? Medical expert here. Hi.
Yeah. Well, they've all been very closely looked at. This is a tangent, isn't it? First one of the episode. We should probably emphasize that we have the royal mummies. We have the mummies of the pharaohs for this time, the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, which is enormously helpful in telling us things like, what their teeth were like, or what other ailments they might have been suffering from, cause of death, age at death, all those sorts of terribly useful things. We have them because they were all discovered in two secret caches, or with one or two exceptions. They were all discovered in these two secret caches. So all the mummies were gathered together after the New Kingdom, when robberies became a problem and the state needed to reclaim some of the precious material in the grave goods. And the mummies were all reburied, but in two secret places. And then they were so successful in squirreling those bodies away that they survived down to modern times. But in the case of almost every other pharaoh who ever lived, the whole of the rest of that 3,500 years worth of history, we don't have the human remains at all. So I think it's one of those things that people tend to know about ancient Egypt is that we have mummies, we have royal mummies. Wow, isn't it amazing? We can look at Ramesses II or Seti I or whoever, but it's only that period, and only because of that specific episode in ancient Egyptian history where they do this reburying. That doesn't happen otherwise.
No, I think there's like Unas, I believe that we had like a bit of his arm or something like that, but then they threw it away.
Yeah, from time to time we have, exactly. We have fragments found in pyramids, for example. I'm not sure if Unas is one of those or not. It might well be.
I think he is. I think that's because I've read a lot when I was writing the book about Unas and his initial discovery, etc. And the robbers had basically gone in and ripped him up.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened in all other cases. Robbers would have got in knowing that precious things were secreted away within the mummy wrappings. So one of the things you want to do if you're robbing a tomb is to unwrap the body, get the stuff.
Play pass and parcel.
If they were wearing things on the body, then you want to get that stuff too if you're a robber. So the mummies themselves, despite the fact that we all talk often about the Egyptians being all very, very religious, or it's terribly lots of rules, you can't break the rules, and all the mummies are very sacred and all that, robbers didn't care. They did not care. The robbers wanted stuff that they could sell. Anyway, we should get back to Amenhotep III, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
He has a reign
get back to Akhetaten.
Yeah, exactly. Eventually. So Amenhotep III has a reign of between 30 and 40 years. He also rules at this time when Egypt is very wealthy and powerful. He was a great builder. So it's Amenhotep III who's largely responsible for the sort of the heart of the Luxor temple, which then becomes one of the major temples in Egypt. He builds the very largest mortuary temple. That's a temple dedicated to his own cult in death, the very largest by miles. Of any of these kings. He builds a little, not little really, he builds a palace and a kind of settlement around it. Sometimes gets referred to as a city. It's a bit small for a city, I think, really, but let's call it a city for sake of argument, in that area as well. And as part of that, he built an absolutely enormous artificial harbour connected to the River Nile by a canal for kind of parading around on in a boat. That harbour is visible in satellite images. You can't really see it on the ground, but you can still see the outline of it in the satellite images, and it is absolutely enormous. I gather that in terms of it's one of my favourite fun facts, in terms of the total amount of debris that would have had to have been dug out of the earth in order to create this harbour, it's bigger by volume than the Great Pyramid, which is a staggering thing. Anyway, so he was building on this grand scale. He also commissioned a vast number of statues of himself and other gods.
When I think of him, I think of there's a great big, it's a relief rather than a statue, and it's of him conquering someone or hitting them. But that might not be him, that might be somebody else, and I've just derailed you again.
No, there are some scenes actually down outside Egypt in what's now Sudan, around the Third Cataract region, a little way to the north, between the Second and Third Cataracts. The Temple of Soleb, where there are a number of reliefs of him and his wife T. And smiting is a fairly standard sort of part of the iconography for the kings.
Yeah.
I suppose what's maybe slightly suspicious about it in Akhenaten, Amenhotep III's case is that we're not really very clear whether he went to war or not. And actually that sets us up quite nicely for what's coming, in that he seems to have slightly lost his marbles in the last few years of his reign. So he's building on a massive scale. He's having all these statues commissioned of himself and gods. There are some hints that it's almost as though he died and made the transition to being a god in heaven, but while he was still alive. So his memorial temple, his mortuary temple, is open and active in the last few years of his reign, as though he is being already worshipped, but we're pretty sure that he was still alive at this point.
Amazing.
And the particular, to some extent, the iconography begins to show some interesting signs. Amenhotep also has himself described in titulary as the dazzling Aten, and the Aten is a manifestation of the sun god. It's a sun disk specifically, eventually with sun's rays descending down from it. That's the way you see it. And Amenhotep seems to describe himself as this. And I'm sort of simplifying and shortening everything down here, but he seems more than any other pharaoh, and pharaoh is always semi-divine, but more than any other pharaoh seems to have made himself into a god. This sets us up for what comes next, we think. So he's succeeded by a son who is also called Amenhotep. That name, Amenhotep, means something like the god Amun is satisfied.
Hotep means happy.
But we can see that the worship of the sun, a different god, is becoming more and more prominent in the reign of Amenhotep III. And then everything begins to change very dramatically under the reign of Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep III's son and successor.
He changes his name, doesn't he?
He changes his name. So let's just deal with that first so that it's not too confusing. So this episode's all about Akhenaten.
Yeah.
As we know, Akhenaten, or Akhenaten.
AKA.
Also known as Amenhotep IV. So he's crowned as Amenhotep IV, but changes his name after a few years, probably about 4 or 5 years, to Akhenaten, which is one of a series of signs that things is changing very dramatically. So in those first few years, this god, the Aten, becomes more and more and more prominent, more or less, eventually to the exclusion of all other gods. So this one specific manifestation of the sun god becomes the only god that can be worshipped, and all of the others sort of disappear.
Oh, can we just underline how nuts this is? Because we are at least like 1,500 years into Egypt, at least.
Yeah.
So for 1,500 years, you've had people roughly worshipping the same gods with the same names, with the same sort of, rituals-ish. But, everybody's sort of like bought into this. Different parts of the regions have their own temples, that sort of thing. Everybody's bought into it. We've got a pharaoh at the top. We've got high priests dotted around the country looking after these temples. And then suddenly somebody goes, actually, no.
They don't
There's
exist,
only one
actually.
God.
No, sorry. Better stop worshipping them because they don't exist.
This isn't just like messing with everybody's like how the universe works and who we pray to and everything else. This is messing with an entire government system. This is everything. This is etch-a-sketching Egypt.
It is, yeah, you're quite right. Yeah. So in fairness, we're not absolutely clear how this played out everywhere in the country. But we can see that at Karnak, which is the great cult center of the god Amun-Ra, which I think we've mentioned in a previous episode, was
Ra,
by this point
sun god,
the principal. Well, Amun-Ra, it's specifically Amun-Ra. So Amun becomes this incredibly important god, and in combination with Ra, preeminent. And Karnak is the cult center of Amun, and thence by the New Kingdom, the cult center of Amun-Ra. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the temples are enormous, and there's not just a high priest, but there's a whole there's a whole coterie of priests and others who are all working in the service of this god. And all kings build in this place. Most of the buildings that you will see in the main part of the Karnak temple complex are buildings of this period, built by successive kings of the New Kingdom. So everybody's doing this. Amenhotep III himself was building here. He built a great pylon. We now call it the third pylon. Great extension to the temple. Everything would have been very glorious under his reign. And then Amenhotep IV comes along and says, exactly as you say, no, actually, Amun doesn't exist. So Akhenaten, as he will become, starts to he does build at Karnak, actually not sort of where everybody else is building, but just a little bit off to the side.
I thought it was quite out the way.
No, his early temple buildings are at Karnak.
Okay, that's cool.
They're at Karnak. They're just the biggest one, the one whose location we're clearest about, is just outside the temple walls.
Oh, okay.
So it's almost as though he was sort of saying, I'm building here, just also not here, because I'm doing things differently. And the temple is very strange. It's nothing like Egyptian temples. Great big open court, loads and loads of very large images of the king himself. These were not discovered. I find this fascinating. These were not discovered until the 1920s. And they are the weirdest statues in Egyptian history. They are colossal statues. So they are all sort of, I would guess, somewhere in the region of about 20 feet high. They show the king with extremely exaggerated features. So a very sort of long face, long chin, long nose, very, very high cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, almost kind of slanting. The shoulders are quite narrow. The waist is quite narrow. The sort of upper body is quite narrow, but then the hips are really wide.
It's very female looking in terms of like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
a female without bosoms, but slightly with bosoms as well. You know, there's some.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes a little bit, and so those statues, as I say, they are absolutely the weirdest in Egyptian art.
There is so much debate about how realistic they were, because obviously they're very stylized, but also it's this sort of case as, did he have like some genetic condition which made him more feminine presenting? Or
yeah, exactly.
What was it?
Exactly. So when these are seen for the first time in the 1920s, having been dug up at Karnak, it immediately prompts all this speculation about, what's going on here. Because they don't even really look Egyptian. If you took 10 statues of kings, 9 of them from other periods and 1 of them these colossal statues of Akhenaten from Karnak, and you said which one is foreign, you don't need to be an Egyptologist, you'd pick this out straight away and say, well, that's not, all the others are sort of the same. This one, no, very different. And it is so strange, as you say, and it has these a strange sort of, is it male or is it female? It's difficult to tell what's going on, and people start to speculate whether or not Akhenaten might actually, this is a genuine likeness of somebody who's suffering from some sort of very strange condition. People start guessing at what this might be. If
you look at the artwork, it's not just him who's drawn very extreme either. It's everybody else.
No, right, exactly. So along with the architecture of these temples at Karnak being quite different, and by the way, the temples aren't standing. They've been discovered, in fragments. But we found that as the practice of the Egyptians, in fact, these temples are dismantled, and the blocks used as the rubble infill for later buildings. So they were recycling the stone. Once archaeologists in the 20th century realized this, they dismantled some of those buildings to recover the Akhenaten blocks, rebuilt the later buildings with sort of neutral, non-archaeological material, and have recovered all of these fragments. And the blocks themselves are interesting in that they are of a particularly small size that's not used in Egyptian construction before or after. So straight away, even if they weren't decorated, you'd be able to tell an Akhenaten era block because they're much smaller. We call them talatat. We're not quite sure how they got that name. And they're not much more than the size of the larger sort of mud bricks that you sometimes get in, say, the Middle Kingdom. So about the length of a sort of somebody's forearm.
A cubit?
Yeah, well, it's exactly something like that. which is much smaller than the blocks that are generally being used elsewhere. There are also many of them extensively decorated, and so altogether we can virtually reconstruct scenes from these temples. And you're quite right, the way that Akhenaten is depicted in these statues is reflected in the art as well, but that goes not just for him, but for any other human figures. They're all depicted in this rather sort of un-Egyptian looking style. The content is kind of unusual as well, in that they're very busy. The scenes are very busy. They show lots of things going on in the temple, lots of figures, lots of sort of very busy activities, but all of it, all focused ultimately on the worship of this one god, the Aten. And this is where I should pick up on something you were saying earlier about how the Aten is depicted, which comes to be, in the very early period, he is occasionally depicted in human form, but it comes to be always the way that the Aten is depicted as a disc, a sun disc, a circle in 2 dimensions, with the sun's rays descending down from it as kind of straight lines coming down from the sun and reaching down with little hands at the end, exactly. Little hands reaching down towards whatever is going on beneath them. So that might be, the scene of a temple, say, or the scene of the city or something like that. But very often it's a scene of Akhenaten, his great royal wife Nefertiti, and quite often their daughters. The most important aspect of this is the idea of the sun, the Aten, the sun, as giving life. Because quite often those little hands are holding symbols. And if there's one symbol we see that those little hands holding more than any other, it's the Ankh sign, that very distinctive sign that gets used,
which is so famous that everybody wants it from the gift shop. Yeah.
Yes, sometimes referred to because it has the meaning of life or living, and sometimes referred to as the key of life. Although that's not really anything to do with.
You only really see it with burials, don't you, or something? The Ankh sign. It's not very common elsewhere. They only used it for certain purposes. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking nonsense.
I think most of the evidence that we have for it probably does come from funerary context. You're right.
But I think people wear it as if to say, "Oh, I love life," and actually, it's sort of a bit like, putting like a sad vase of lilies, and going, "Ah, life." In our context.
All Egyptian kind of funerary practice and belief is all about life, actually, but life after death. In that sense. So death is not the end. Yeah. For the Egyptians, absolutely not.
Unless Amit's gobbles your heart.
Yes. Yeah,
there's always
they
that.
all dodge that, of course.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yes, so the Aten is giving life, and this is the essence of the new way. So we've got new architecture, new blocks to build things from, new style of depicting human beings in art, new sort of types of scene that you see in temple walls. Akhenaten is absolutely at the center of all of this, along with his great royal wife Nefertiti, who is extremely prominent. And then this is where we get the great moment of change. We're not exactly sure when, but around about his 4th or 5th year, this is the point at which he's still Amenhotep up to this point. This is the point at which he changes his name to Akhenaten, which is the name he's much better known by, which rather than his previous name being the god Amun is satisfied means something like effective for the Aten, Akhetaten, effective for the Aten. And that obviously symbolizes the change in Egyptian state religion from Amun worship to Aten worship. And this is the most observable aspect of what you were describing, where you've got an entire population, an entire country that for years and years and years has been told the most important god, the king of the gods indeed, the one to whom the most Egyptian temples are dedicated, including the very largest, the focus of all building activity at Karnak. Actually, no, sorry, we were wrong. He doesn't actually exist now. And so all of you priests, I don't know what you're going to do now. Just probably have to find a different job. And
I mean, how to make yourself overwhelmingly unpopular with your top brass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great way to annoy people. And maybe that's the reason why another of his changes, which comes in at this same time, is to completely move the administration to a brand new site in the middle of nowhere in Middle Egypt, to found a new capital city on a completely virgin ground. And he makes it very clear in a series of inscriptions that this is what he wanted to do. Going to put the city here. Nobody's ever built here before. It's a marvelous place. And the city's going to be called the Horizon of the Aten, Akhetaten. And it is an incredible place. And he's going to build a city here. And the first time it was recognized as such, I suppose, was the early 19th century. That city, I'm skipping ahead in the story here, was not only built on virgin ground, it was also abandoned very quickly after the end of Akhenaten's mad period of changing everything, with the result that it is largely all still there. And rather than being buried under layers and layers and layers and layers of later occupation, as most Egyptian cities are,
new decoration.
There's just the one single phase, which makes it an absolute godsend for archaeologists, because you haven't got the complication of all of these later phases. You've just got this one thing. And there it is, sitting in the desert.
I want to know how far away from the Nile and like just general other places it is.
Because it's right on the Nile.
Okay, it's right on the Nile, so that's okay. At least there's that.
It's right on the Nile, yeah. So to describe it, it is a rough, very, very roughly sort of midway between Cairo and Luxor in present-day Minya Governorate, about an hour from the capital city of that governorate, which is Minya. On the east side of the river, it is more or less right on the edge of the cultivation, actually. So Egyptian geography being what it is, you've got the River Nile, and you've got a thin strip of cultivated land, agricultural land, either side. So if you, and again, conveniently the river running almost dead straight north-south, as it is at this point in Egypt, for most of it, not all of it, for most of it, it is here. If you imagine looking at a map, you've got the river, then you've got thin strip either side, east and west. And if you just follow slightly further east of that cultivated strip, you hit the desert, and that is where the city is, ranged along the edge of the cultivated land. What's most fantastic about the site is that the next part of Egyptian geography is you get the desert, you get what we call the low desert, which is the sort of flat or slightly lumpy, bumpy, low-lying desert, but that quite quickly changes to what we call the high desert, or sometimes the mountains, depending on how high and spectacular it is. And that's where suddenly the elevation of the ground rises significantly. And in this part of the world, the high desert is obviously to the east of the city, and it forms a kind of crescent around the east of the city. So if you're looking at a map or looking at a satellite image of the part of the world, you can see this great arcing crescent shape, like a backwards C shape, if you like. So that forms the backdrop to the city.
That's quite pleasant, like it's being cupped by it. No.
Yeah, and it if you're looking from the city, if you're looking out towards that, what you're seeing is a line of the cliffs, a bit like a great big curtain. If you were looking directly eastwards from the city, you'd see that sort of curtain is in an arc. So off to the north, off to your left, if you like, as you're looking east, the cliffs are quite close to the city. And if you look off to the right, down to the south, they're quite close. But if you look straight ahead in the middle, they're quite far away, creating this great big arc. And also, this is the best part, in the middle of those cliffs, there's a gap. And that's a kind of extinct water channel, a wadi, which would convey water down from the high desert down into the low desert in times of flash flood, for example. But most of the time, of course, it's just dry. And that wadi is the same kind of wadi as the Valley of the Kings, which is also a high desert wadi, essentially. One of these network of little sort of valleys in the high desert mountains. And if you're standing in the right place in the city Akhetaten, Akhenaten's new capital city, at the right time of year, but also the right time of day as the sun is rising, you see the sun rising in exactly that gap in the cliffs.
Nice.
And the Egyptian symbol for horizon, in fact, is essentially sort of two mountains with a gap in between them and the sun rising in between the two of them. So it's as though they chose this place because you know, it actually, you get a kind of very natural physical embodiment, enactment of this hieroglyphic symbol for the horizon. And of course, Akhenaten is obsessed with the sun disk, the sun. The city is called the horizon of the Aten, and there it is. It is kind of magical, actually. So the city is in the middle of nowhere and not in a great place strategically, but purely in religious terms and purely in terms of, you know, thinking about the Aten, it's an amazing place.
There might be a case to say that Akhenaten, while his dad was going a bit mad, surrounded himself with very forward-thinking, frustrated artists and architects.
Yes.
And they
Yeah,
just basically just went, we've got such a good idea. You've got to let us do this. Because I can't imagine this is one man. Because bless him, but how is the pharaoh going to know about this place unless he has got a well of support behind him? It does suggest that there are other Egyptians really interested in doing this. And it might just simply be people who got turned down to be high priest of somewhere and are annoyed and want to annoy other, you know, it could all be political backstabbing and stuff.
Absolutely
but there
right.
is an amazing story to be sort of unpicked here. And alas, I don't think we've got much evidence for the other characters, do we?
Nail on head, Izzy. You're right. So I think we have to bear all these different things in mind. There's the religious side of all of this. And that's the first and most obvious sort of, you know, aspect of all these changes is the change to religion. And the reason we started off with Amenhotep III, thank you very much for starting off with that, is that those changes you can see those changes beginning to happen in his time. So he's not quite so focused on the art, and he doesn't stop worshipping all the other gods, Akhenaten's father. But the Aten does become more prominent. Solar worship becomes more prominent. There's something funny is happening. You know, all these statues, all these temples, all this grand design of building and everything. There's maybe some very religious zealot who is absolutely, and maybe it's Akhenaten himself, who's absolutely possessed with this idea that no, I've seen the light. There's literally only one God. Actually, all these other gods are sort of false gods. So there's only one God, and the most important aspect of this God's role in the world, if you like, is to provide life. The sun provides life for us all. You know,
it's obvious.
Isn't it? Exactly. So forget everything else. We've just got all that is important is that we worship the sun. And then, then maybe there are some artists and architects as well going, yes, brilliant. Not really interested in the religious side of things, but I do want to build amazing buildings, capturing the sunlight, and let's position all the buildings in such a way that the sun shines in such a direction and everything's all marvelous. There are engineers, meanwhile, tearing their hair out. It's like, you can't build a city here. You can't build a city here. How are we going to convey sufficient quantities of water to the population? And how are we going to move everybody? This is a ridiculous waste of money. But meanwhile, you're quite right. There might be other politicians going, well, I don't believe in any of this religious nonsense either. I can't be bothered with what temples look like and where the sun rises. But as you say, I didn't get that job in the Amun temple. I hate that guy who got the Amun temple job. So if this is the way for Akhenaten to change everything and sack that other guy and make me the chief priest of the Aten temple, I don't care. I'm doing it. But you're also right. We don't know any of this stuff because we don't have the evidence for it. But it's important, I think, that we think these things through, even if we don't know the answers.
I think because of my brain and because of the sort of, I write historical fiction, that's my basic job. And because of that, I always look for other examples. So I would say, if you look at the court of Henry VIII, while he's making the country from a Catholic country in this is the UK in the 16th century. He turns Britain from a Catholic country into a Protestant country where he becomes the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope. Almost every historian and every one of his contemporaries says he was still Catholic when he died. He was still doing everything the Catholic way. He didn't really, he was still, saying all his prayers in Latin and everything else. And it's all the different political reasons, and it's all the different figures who are moving him this way and that. It's Anne Boleyn, it's everything. And how complicated that was. And that is far less a change than what is happening in Egypt at this time. Because this time, that is still worshipping the same God, still worshipping his son, still going to church at certain times and doing very similar prayers, still the same text, admittedly in a different language. But it completely, we're still, going through the ramifications of Henry VIII's reign. There's a guy who does a podcast who's, was it you who was telling me about this? Somebody was telling me, I think it's Jay Foreman or somebody like that, doing a whole thing about how everything is Henry VIII, and you can trace almost every bit of history down to that one man and what he was doing. But literally, this is so much bigger than that. This is hugely monumental. And the idea as well of monotheism. I don't know if anybody's seen this anywhere before.
Yeah, people have often tried to draw parallels between Akhenaten's religion and the Abrahamic religions, monotheism elsewhere. There's no clear and demonstrable connection, you can't join all the dots. But having said that, not only is there the similarity in there just apparently being one God, but there's one particular text as well, which is composed around this time specifically for this purpose. We call it the Hymn to the Aten, which crops up in tombs here and there. Is very similar in some passages to one of the Psalms in the Bible, I believe. Again, it could be coincidence, because tying together all of the important elements of a supernatural being, in particular, sort of a being that's in charge of creating the world, bringing the world into being, and then also kind of continuing to sort of create life and provide life force for things. Seems to me to be a fairly sort of natural human impulse to want to see that sort of thing as being the responsibility of a supernatural being, and combining all these different what were different gods elsewhere all into the one thing. And it may just be that Akhenaten or somebody on his behalf has that idea, and then somebody else also somewhere else in the world has a similar sort of idea, so they look the same without there being a direct connection. But people have tried to see that very often, and there are even people that think that Akhenaten under a different name is one of the biblical characters.
All of these ideas, particularly in this area of the world, are very, ideas do travel. It's not like there's an Atlantic or a Pacific Ocean in between. This is just, bits of the Med and bits of the Red Sea and stuff. It's not, everything is, ideas spread, particularly when they're weird.
Yeah, absolutely. And they travel often orally in ways that are not detectable to archaeology. So if somebody has a story, even if Akhenaten was remembered, which he really wasn't in archaeology, we're skipping ahead here slightly. He was kind of proscribed and he was deliberately forgotten. But there may well have been a kind of folk memory of what he was doing. And even if most people were, kind of thought, oh, it was a terrible time, everything went weird for a bit, and then it all came back together again. And it was fine.
I missed stuff.
Yeah,
Sorry.
exactly. Yeah, but there might have been other people who sort of thought, do you know what though? I did quite like some of the ideas. We should. You just reminded me actually. So we should say he sets up all these inscriptions around Amarna, explaining this is where I'm going to build a city. It's going to have this. It's going to have this, and it's all going to be for the art, and it's going to be marvelous. Being a cynic, I might think to myself, yeah, well, you say that, but it's going to be hard, isn't it? Are you going to do it? It's going to be very hard, you silly sausage. I know all your advisors will be telling you it's going to be too hard. But actually, this city, as I mentioned, was happened upon by some of the earliest European explorers. The Napoleonic expedition recorded the remains of something there, even though they didn't really know what it was. Because of the fact that Akhenaten and his city and everything was deliberately forgotten and dismantled and all taken apart. There was no surviving trace of what happened in any of the records that the earliest Egyptologists and explorers were looking at. So they had no idea this was a strange period had happened. And then people start to go to this part of the world. And the first time there was any inkling of it was when an English Egyptologist called John Gardner Wilkinson was taken to some of the rock-cut tombs, the elite tombs that are at the north end of the site, which are decorated with this very strange style of decoration. And so Gardner Wilkinson, knowing his Egyptian art and iconography, goes there and is like, what is this? This is super weird. And there appears to be a king here and there, but his name's chiseled out everywhere. So this is weird. Don't know who this is because, hieroglyphic inscriptions everywhere, but every time the name of the king appears inside a name ring, so you know where it is, you can see the name ring, but the name's been erased. It's only, eventually some instances of that name survive, and we can now put a name to this king, Akhenaten. We also know, though, from all of this, that this indeed was the city that he planned to build. And although the stone largely has gone, the mud brick, and it's mud brick that the Egyptians used to build most things, particularly houses and other sort of the buildings of life rather than cult practice or tombs, death. All of these survive, at least in the foundations. So we have a complete sort of map of this city. And indeed, there were some very, very large temples there, some very large palaces, other associated administrative buildings. We have the Office of Correspondence of the Pharaoh, for example. You can still go and visit that with the mud bricks stamped with that name on them, so we can identify the building. And we estimate, or rather, dearly departed Professor Barry Kemp, who really sadly passed away just a year or two ago, shock to everyone, who had worked at the site for 40 or so years. His estimate was that the city was occupied by between 30 and 50,000 people, probably closer to the higher end. So, and we know from the fact that Akhenaten's reign lasted such and such an amount of time, about 16 years, and that he didn't make this move until about 4 or 5 years into that he manages to build an entire capital city and move 50,000 people there in a very short space of time. So, for all that we might say he was crazy, he did it, or, he and his team.
It is utterly mad and brilliant.
Mad.
And it shows the power of the pharaoh, though. It shows the flaw in the system in some respects. Because you have to go with what the pharaoh says, even if you are a... Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In the hands of a loon.
Obviously, this doesn't last forever. So what happens to Akhenaten?
Well, we don't exactly know. We think that he reigned, as I say, around 16 years, and we're basing this on highest regnal dates again. So I think we mentioned this in a previous episode, but Egyptologists, because the deaths are generally not recorded. It's annoying. It would have been brilliant.
You don't die. You carry on in the afterlife. It's fine.
Yes, precisely. But that moment of passing from the one life to the next, if that was recorded and dated, that'd be so helpful. And they don't do that. So what we have to do is, for a pharaoh like Akhenaten, is gather up all the inscriptions, gather up all the ones that have got dates on, and look for the highest date. And whichever is the highest date, we think to ourselves, okay, so here's a thing that's dated year 16. So he must have reigned into a year 16. That's at least 15 complete years. And then, because the reign begins year 1, day 1, if you see what I mean, 15 complete years and into a 16, at least, maybe a little bit more. Perhaps one day somebody will dig up an inscription that says year 17, and then we'll be able to extend the reign a bit. But we think 16. So he wasn't there for very long. There's then an awful lot of arguing among scholars about what happens, who takes over. But something we know for certain is that our good friend Tutankhamun, in fact, was born Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, and he changed his name as well. He later changed his name to Tutankhamun, but so he goes the other way. His predecessor goes from being Amenhotep to Akhenaten, the boy king, celebrated boy king, goes from being Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. And that symbolizes the transition back to the old ways. So we know that that's the sort of Tutankhamun's reign. For all that he's famous for gold and treasure in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, actually he might just as well be famous for being the pharaoh who put back all the old ways after this mad period of Akhenaten's revolution. We're not entirely sure just what happens in between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, or even if anything at all happens. It's, I think, still just about possible that Tutankhamun was his direct successor, so more or less put things back immediately. But more likely, I think, there were one or two other pharaohs ruling in between for a very short period of time. But what we know is that the city was abandoned. One aspect of the design of the city was that Akhenaten had a royal tomb built for himself at his new capital city in a kind of version of the Valley of the Kings. Actually, should I explain this? Because that's a cool aspect of the city too.
Go on then.
So, do you remember that little break in the cliffs?
Yeah.
Where the sun rises in between the mountains, and it's all kind of completely perfect. If you go into that gap in the cliffs, which is a wadi, as I mentioned, it's like you're going along a dried up riverbed. And if you go along that, it winds a bit. But if you go along this windy, dried up riverbed for about 5 kilometers, you eventually come to what was discovered in the late 19th century, which is the royal tomb, the tomb that Akhenaten built for himself, absolutely in the Valley of the Kings style, a long kind of corridor type arrangement cut down into the bedrock. There's a whole story to that. But another thing that's kind of perfect about this city is that, again, if you're standing in the city, right time, right place, you look out towards the east, you observe the sun rising. Not only are you seeing the sun rising in between those two sort of mountains, as it were, just like the hieroglyphic sign for Akhet, but you might know also that is exactly the location of the royal tomb. So the sun, exactly as per the Egyptians' conception of what happens with the rebirth of the spirit of the king every day when the sun is rising, that is rising directly out of where we know the king's tomb is. So the location of that, the sighting of that tomb is completely perfect.
I want to also point out how weird it is that he's buried in the east with the rising sun rather than the west with the setting sun.
Yes, well. You're quite right to point that out. Yes, so normally, you're absolutely right. For the Egyptians, tombs are in the west because of the association of the sun setting and that moment of the end of the day and the end of life. You're right. Akhenaten flicks that around and has it be more about rebirth and the beginning of something, which fits with his whole art and creation thing. It
fits with the whole thing of just basically turning Egypt on its head. Because
yes. I mean, it's all quite brilliant, isn't it? I'm talking myself into thinking it was all brilliant. We know, of course, Tutankhamun is buried in the Valley of the Kings. So not only does he change his name, when we think change all the old ways back and restore the worship of the old gods and that sort of thing, the Valley of the Kings is restored as the royal cemetery as well. And that is the signal that by this point, Akhenaten's city is being abandoned as well. So the city is indeed abandoned. We're not really clear when. We know that a lot of the stone from the temples at Amarna was recycled, particularly by the great recycler and usurper Ramses II, a few reigns later.
200 years or something, is it? Yeah.
Not even that. So the major state buildings are gone. And of course, once you sort of drain a city of all of that sort of thing, all of its support, and it's not in a brilliant place strategically or in terms of feeding a population or keeping them fed and watered, it's not in a brilliant place. So people will have just gone back, wherever they were before, providing archaeologists with this amazing sealed time capsule, but also bringing Akhenaten's a heresy to an end.
Yeah.
And maybe we should just finish that off by saying, we've sort of hinted at it already. So his city is abandoned. There's clearly a great sort of distaste for Akhenaten as well. So where he had done so much to trample all over the traditional religion, he'd also at a certain point had his people hack out the name of the god Amun from from temples. That name was then restored. The Valley of the Kings is restored. There's an inscription of Tutankhamun's that talks about the restoration and about how the temples had been allowed to fall into ruin. And of course, they were now revived. So everything was going back. Akhenaten's temples are dismantled and the building material unceremoniously reused in the rubble, infill and foundations for later buildings. And then you get this phenomenon at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, just a little while after Akhenaten's time, of writing king lists, creating king lists. The idea of this is that the new dynastic line of the 19th dynasty, and by the way, because Tutankhamun dies with no children, that's the end of the 18th dynasty royal family, which had been on the throne for generations, for centuries. Tutankhamun is the end of the line. He's succeeded by 3 commoners, a senior sort of official called I, a military commander called Horemheb, and then another military commander called Ramesses. And of those, Ramesses is the first to pass the throne not to another high-ranking official, but to his own son, Seti I, and that establishes a new dynastic line. And we think the reason for the king lists that Seti I and Ramesses II in particular create is that maybe they were a little bit nervous that they're trying to start a new line here, but they're not the line that, they are new and they're not actually descended from royalty. But if what they were thinking is if we create a really long list of all the kings of Egypt going back to the very beginning and we put ourselves at the end, then it'll make it seem like we're part of the gang.
Related. Yeah.
Part of the gang.
Because isn't the point of the pharaoh that you're actually meant to be related to the god, directly to, you are a god effectively. So who your dad is important.
Yeah,
because,
I mean, there's a lot of sort of flexibility in the way things.
I seem to remember Hatshepsut having a sort of thing about, actually my dad was actually a god who impregnated my mother and that sort of thing.
Absolutely, we must talk about this in another episode because that's a great legitimizing device as well. So pharaohs are sort of worried about this kind of thing, that people will go, "You're not the real pharaoh," and they go, "Well, actually, there's a great big inscription here that says I am." But what they do. The reason this is relevant to Akhenaten's story is that so you've got this long list of names going right the way back to the beginning of the first dynasty. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, if indeed she was pharaoh, which we think she might have been, we haven't even talked about that. Tutankhamun and one or two others who we know were important around that time. They're all missed out of the list. So the list goes directly from Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, who was clearly, although a bit bonkers, still considered to be legitimate. The next king after that is the military commander Horemheb. And it's as though everything that happened in between didn't happen, never happened.
Well, maybe it didn't. Maybe it's all a fever dream and you've just discovered a city that's not actually there and all of that never happens. It's such a great story. There is so much. I wish there were more written about it. Who were the people involved, the characters, the players? Because although we sort of look at it as one man's great sort of I'm just going to change everything, it was obviously a group of people who were influencing him and doing things as well.
We do know a bit. Am I allowed to say?
Well, let's. Why don't we do it as a bonus episode?
Bonus episode.
There you go. So hopefully people will join our Patreon, and then they'll get access to all of our bonus episodes. Some are much better than others, but this one's going to be a doozy. So it's worth just going along.
Secret content, free extra content, free ice creams.
Free, and I don't think we can promise that, and it's not exactly free because we've got to actually, we're investing a lot of our time in this.
Sorry, that was that's not true.
Our plan is, we don't want to accept advertising, and we want to basically make his content as accessible to people as possible. So if you get along and sponsor us by going to our Patreon and getting the free bonus episodes, you will basically help support us in that way, and that way we'll continue to make stuff. But until we make more stuff, Chris, we should say goodbye, shouldn't we? Instead of doing our usual goodbye, we should really do one in the style of Akhenaten. So, Chris, why don't you take it away and just start to read how he might have said goodbye in some sort of prayer?
It's quite a long goodbye, but anyway, why not? How manifold it is what thou hast made. They are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other. Thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou wert alone. It's a bit oldie-fashioned, isn't it? Yeah, are you still awake, anyone?
That's not in it.
All men, cattle, and... Are you just going to fade? You're going to fade me out, right?
I was going to fade you out, but I wanted more just to keep you going.
Okay, well,
me talking. Yeah, just read the whole thing.
Wild beasts, whatever is on earth going upon its feet, and what is on high flying with its wings. The countries of Syria and Nubia, the land of Egypt, thou settest every man in his place. Thou suppliest their necessities. Everyone has his food, and his time of life is reckoned. Their tongues are separate in speech, and their natures as well. Their skins are distinguished as thou distinguishest the foreign peoples. Thou makest a Nile in the underworld. I'm getting there. We're nearly there. Thou bringest forth as thou desirest to maintain the people of Egypt, according as thou madest them for thyself, the Lord of all of them, wearying himself with them, the Lord of every land rising for them, the Aten of the day, great of majesty. And I feel
Cheerio.
Like
yeah, exactly. It does feel like the Lord's Prayer, doesn't it?
It does, but I won't say Amen, I shall say Aten.
Thanks for listening to Talk Like an Egyptian. To support the podcast and ensure another series, join us on patreon.com/Talk Like an Egyptian and unlock bonus content. Get in touch, talklikeanegyptianpod@gmail.com or use the hashtag TLAE. We need your questions for the end of the series, so please don't hold back. Remember to leave us 5 stars of newts and share this episode with your friends. Find all links at talklikeanegyptian.com.